All right. Hello. Hi there. Welcome to the course. This is, as you've already read, a course about Spanish, and we're going to get right into all of the delicious details of the Spanish language. But before we do that, I do want to talk to you very quickly about a couple of things that you may think, things that I've experienced, things that a lot of my students have experienced in learning a foreign language. And first of all, I just want to get all of that out of the way. That way, as you progress and progress and progress, you know in your head that this is completely normal, and more importantly, that it's temporary. So, what is the first thing? Well, the first thing is that it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter if you're like talented or anything like that. You can learn a foreign language, and you can learn it in a relatively short amount of time. I mean, given how large a language is, it doesn't really come down to like some special gift or anything like that. And that's really all I have to say. I've heard my students say that I can do things like learn languages because I'm talented or because I'm smart and things like that. I'm not like a super gifted person. I would say I have a pretty average brain. And so if I can do it, you can do it. And there will be times whenever you're learning that you feel like you're not getting anywhere. You'll feel frustrated. You'll feel like you're just not making any progress, running in place, things like that. It's completely normal. And as you get deeper and deeper into the language, we'll talk about different ways that you can break out of that, if you will. So that's pretty much all I have to say. In the next video, we're going to be diving into exactly what we're going to be learning and how we're going to go about doing that. So just remember, doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter how talented you are, as long as you have a normal functioning human brain, normal, quote unquote, then you'll be able to do this successfully. So this has been Andrew, and I will see you in the next video. Now, welcome to your first Spanish lesson. We're going to go ahead and dive right into it, and we're going to look at some basic phrases, a lot of which you probably already know, which is the good news. And there are some phrases in here that you're probably not going to know. Just remember, you can totally memorize them. And the best part about these phrases is that they're so common that you're going to hear them all the time. So even if you don't have a good rote memory or what have you, it's going to be really easy to memorize them because you're going to hear them all the time, especially once you know them. You hear some people speak Spanish, you'll probably hear these phrases at the beginning and end of the conversation. So we'll go ahead and start off with los saludos, which is going to be greetings. Now, the first one you probably already know, which is hola, and that just means hello or hi. You'll hear it all the time. And the second one down beneath it, you might not have seen before, and that is oye. Oye means hey, essentially, and it's an informal kind of hi, just like in English, hey is an informal hi. You can use it to greet someone, or you can use it to get someone's attention. Like if someone dropped their wallet, in English I would say, hey, you dropped your wallet. In Spanish, you could do the same thing. You say, oye, and then you dropped your wallet, which we'll learn how to say later. But anyway, so that's pretty much it. I will do a separate thing about pronunciation specifically dedicated to it, but for now, just notice that we do not pronounce the H here. So this is just for decoration. So I don't say hola, I always say hola. The H is for decoration. And then the Y right here, the Y, is going to be oye. So it's pronounced like a Y, just like in English, a U or yield, what have you. Oye, right? And then we have las despedidas, which is goodbyes. And we have one word spelled two different ways, and that is chao, which is a word you probably already know, and that just means bye. Now, I would say that this first spelling right here is the most common spelling, though you will see it sometimes spelled with a U. Both words mean the same thing. It just kind of depends on what country you're in, where you are. At the end of the day, it's more or less pronounced the same way, chao. And then the second way to say goodbye here is adios, which also means goodbye. Now, you may be wondering which one to use and which one to not use. In my experience, ciao is the most common one, and it's the one that you're going to hear all the time. It's kind of a casual bye, see you later type of thing, whereas adios is going to be more of a longer goodbye. So if someone was going on a trip, I would probably say adios instead of saying ciao, right? Because they're going away for a longer period of time. It doesn't mean that I'll never see them again. It just means they're going away for a little while. Now, we do have a bonus round, which is a couple of extra phrases that you're going to hear all the time, or at least some of the time. The most common of which is at the top, and that's hasta luego. hasta luego, you may already know, means like see you soon, see you later, talk to you soon, things like that. Hasta pronto means more or less the same thing. And then hasta la vista, which if you've ever seen an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, you know this means see you later, see you soon, whatever, things like that. Now we have hasta entonces, which is a little different. It means until then. The word hasta in Spanish literally means until, and the word entonces means then. So if we set a date, for example, to talk, let's say we're going to talk on Saturday, then I would say, okay, hasta entonces, meaning, okay, see you then, see you on Saturday. And lastly, we have nos vemos, another very common phrase that I hear in my personal experience quite a bit, and it means see you soon, see you later, okay, talk to you soon, bye. A couple of things to be said about the pronunciation here, and like I said, don't worry too much about it. We're going to go over it separately, but the first thing is the H, once again, is silent, so you just say hasta. And then a couple of other things to be said here. The V in Spanish is actually pronounced like a B. I know that's weird, but it's pronounced like a B. So you would not say hasta la vista. You would not say that. You would say hasta la vista. So it's hasta la vista. And same thing right here. Nos vemos. Nos vemos. Right? So that is going to be the long and short of it. Now, culturally, we are going to talk a little bit about how you should and how you shouldn't say goodbye in a Spanish-speaking country. If you're American or you're British or you're from an English-speaking country, the way that we do things is typically going to be a little different than how they do it in a Spanish-speaking country. Part of the problem that you're going to run into whenever you're in a Spanish-speaking country is not knowing how to say hi or goodbye with your body. And what I mean by that is it's very easy to learn how to say hi and bye, with the language, just say the words and things like that. But as in most countries, we don't just greet people or say goodbye with our words. We also say goodbye with our bodies. In some countries, people hug. In others, they kiss. In other countries, it's kind of an invasion of people's privacy bubble, their little bubble of space around them, and what have you. So in Spanish-speaking countries, what do we do? Do we do a fist bump? Do we do a high five? Well, first of all, the fist bump at this point in time, I think, is almost a universal concept. Same thing with the high five. People do it everywhere. So that's good news. And I'll teach you how to say high five or give me a dap later. But for now, whenever we greet people, whether it be formally, informally, what do we do in these Spanish-speaking countries? And I would give you a whole spiel about how this is what we do in Cuba or this is what they do in Colombia and so on and so forth. But frankly, it would be such a long, long conversation and it wouldn't really be worth your time. The best recommendation that I can give to you is if you know that you're going to Colombia, go ahead and get in touch with some Colombians and just ask them what they do or Google it. And most importantly, whenever you're actually in the country, make sure to observe, and then you'll know exactly what to do. Just ask yourself questions. Do they know each other? Do they not know each other? Is it a man and a man and a woman, or a woman and a woman? Those are going to be the main questions that you can ask yourself to kind of get a sense of how people say hello and goodbye in that particular culture. And then, obviously the first week or so, it's going to be a little rough around the edges. But after that, you're going to more or less know how you should be behaving and how you should address people and so on and so forth. So that's kind of my sweeping generalization and kind of the best advice I can give you to adapt to any given country, because frankly, in some countries, they kiss on both cheeks. In other countries, they kiss you on one cheek. In others, they hug. In others, they don't. So it's better to just teach you to just observe people and do some research before you go. Make sure to talk to the locals. And that's pretty much it. But if you do have any specific questions about a certain country, by all means, feel free to let me know. We just learned a bunch of new phrases, and part of that is going to be learning not just what they are and what they mean, but also how to say them correctly. And I'm going to try to avoid going off on a whole tangent about pronunciation, but for now, I just want you to know that it's super important to be able to develop good habits early. It's much more difficult to break old habits later than it is to just develop new habits from the beginning, though it can seem quite the contrary sometimes. So, with that being said, we're going to look at the pronunciation of some of the words that we just saw, starting with hola. We already know that the H is going to be silent in Spanish. We simply don't pronounce it. So you would say o and then la. Now, there's a couple of other things here. You can see that we have some vowels. We have the O and the A. And the cool thing about Spanish is that it's an extremely predictable language in terms of how you pronounce the words. All of the vowels, all of those different things, for the most part, only have one pronunciation. So it's extremely predictable. In English, the pronunciation of the word A can completely change depending on the word. So it's the A in day or decade, but in other words, it's going to be completely different. Like, for example, sat. In that case, it's more of a sound, right? In Spanish, it's just one pronunciation. So the O in Spanish, the O, is going to be kind of pronounced like the O in bone, but a little different, all right? You're going to try not to move your lips. So you'll just say O, O, O. And you can remember to practice that whenever you're just kind of walking around your house. The A is pronounced like the A in father. So you would say O, A, O, la. And that's how you get that pronunciation, hola, just like that. Now, same thing here with the A and the O. It's just A and then O. And you combine them to get ow, okay? And then with the CH, which is pronounced like in English, like chip, for example, you would say cha, o, chow, chow. And that's how you get that sound. Then we kind of briefly discussed this before. The V is pronounced like a B in Spanish. Now, the other important thing is the I, right? The I has different pronunciations in English. Sometimes it's pronounced like the I in high, and other times it's pronounced like a I, for example, in hit or spit. It's a very short sound. The interesting thing here is that in Spanish, it's pronounced like a E, all right? Almost like in feet or see or reach. It's that same exact pronunciation. And the beautiful thing is it never changes. So you would say a, right? Like in fa, father. So you'd say hasta la vista. Hasta la vista. And then here we have nos vemos, right? So it's nos vemos. The E in Spanish is actually pronounced more like the, I guess you would say the E in bed. So it's nos vemos, vemos. Then lastly, we have adios. I will say this, and we're going to talk about this in more detail later, but whenever you have an I and an O next to each other, it creates almost like a Y sound. So you wouldn't really say adios. You kind of combine them and say adios, Dios. Almost like the word yo, if you will, in English. And we're going to see this in a lot more words later on. But for now, focus on this. The H is silent. Pronounce this like an O in bone. This like a in father, or an A in father. Hola. And then lastly, pronounce the V like a B. And the I is pronounced like a E in feet. So it's hasta la vista. Now, obviously, that's a lot of information, but as we learn more and more words, you're going to be seeing this so often, it's going to be completely natural. The next thing that we're going to talk about is something that can seem rather theoretical or even academic, but if you understand this concept, then you're going to be able to say a lot of different things in Spanish in a pretty short amount of time. So I know that this is going to seem very theoretical or academic, but please bear with me and trust me, it will bear fruit. Now, we're going to talk about what an infinitive verb is. As with most technical terms, it's a rather fancy word for a simple concept. An infinitive verb is just a verb that has no subject, right? So in this example sentence, I want to go, you can see that the word want, the verb, has a subject, I. But over here we have to go. To go has no subject in this case. It's just attached to the word want. And so we can consider that an infinitive verb. Anytime you hear someone say it's an infinitive verb, It just means that it has no subject. That's all it means. Want, on the other hand, has a subject, and so it would be considered a finite verb. So you have infinitive, and then you have finite, and that's basically it. Another word that you'll hear people throw around quite a bit is the term conjugated verb or conjugation. Conjugation just means that it's changing, right? You change the verb. So an example of this would be I go, which is a finite verb because it has a subject. And then you have she goes. You notice that the verb transformed. We added an es. And so in this case, you could say that she goes would be considered an infinitive verb. The goes, at least, would be considered a conjugated verb, not an infinitive verb. I misspoke. Sorry about that. Now, we go down here, and you can see we have I want to go. Once again, I guess you could consider want a conjugated verb. We didn't really change anything. It's definitely a finite verb, but if we switched it to she wants to go, then wants is a conjugated finite verb. And then we have to go, which is, as we've already talked about before, an infinitive verb. So, just to review, an infinitive verb is a verb with no subject. A finite verb is a verb with a subject. If we conjugate a verb, that just means that we change it. Maybe we add an s, maybe we add an es, and that is really all it means. So, why is this talk of infinitive verbs useful? Well, in Spanish, they also have the concept of an infinitive verb, and they can be divided into 3 different categories, essentially, and that is AR verbs, ER verbs, and IR verbs, right? So an AR verb is just an infinitive verb that ends in AR. That's really all it is. So if you wanted to say to need, for example, in Spanish, you would say necesitar, necesitar. You'll notice it ends in an AR. Same thing with to help. You would just say ayudar, ayudar, right? Same exact thing right here. Now, as in English, in Spanish, we also conjugate our verbs. The key difference here is that in Spanish, we always conjugate the verb for every subject ever, right? In English, we only conjugate the verb sometimes. So I would say, for example, I need, they need, we need, you need. You'll notice that the verb need never changes. But then if I say she needs, he needs, it needs, now I'm adding an s. So I do conjugate the verb, but only sometimes in English, only sometimes. On the other hand, in Spanish, you will always conjugate the verb, meaning you will always change the verb according to what the subject is, right? So let's look at some examples. First, we need to know how to say a couple of subject pronouns in Spanish. The first one is going to be I, which is yo, and the second one is going to be you, which is tú, okay? Yo and tú. Now, let's conjugate the verbs. In order to say I need in Spanish, you would say yo necesito, yo necesito. Then yo ayudo is I help. You'll notice that they both have the same exact ending. So to put it differently, we always make the same changes to the verb. We always make the same changes. So if it's for yo, we add an o. That's it. Now, just to kind of give you an idea of what's happening, take a look here. You can see we have this verb, necesitar, right? It has an AR. We took off the AR and we added an o. And now it means yo necesito. Same thing with ayudar. Take off the AR, add the o, yo ayudo. All right? Now, you're not going to memorize this in one day, but as long as you understand the concept, you're in good shape. Doesn't mean you have to know it all. Just means you understand it. Now, what I would like you to do is very, very simple. Just kind of go over this concept, right? Try to say this yourself. Yo necesito. Yo ayudo. Now, there's another infinitive verb that you probably already know, which is hablar. Hablar means to speak, and you've probably heard it used in the sentence yo hablo, right? For like I speak Spanish, I speak English. Most English speakers at least know that phrase, right? It's the same exact concept, my friend. It's just an AR verb. Let me go back here. It's hablar. And then you conjugate it, so you say yo hablo. Practice saying this, and then once you've done that 3 or 4 times, go ahead and move on to the next video. Now, my intention in this video is to kind of make you think a little bit, not necessarily to blow your mind, but it might blow your mind. Who knows? Let me know, and make sure to have a bag with you if I do blow your mind. Now, what I want to do is just ask you the question, how do you say, I need to help in Spanish? How do you say it? Just think about it, right? I'll give you a second, maybe give you 3 seconds, okay? Take your time. Okay, hopefully you got it. The answer was to simply say, yo necesito ayudar. Yo necesito ayudar. Right? And that's it. That's all there really is to it, because we have the word I need to help. And it's the same exact concept as what we learned before, right? To help is the infinitive verb. And so in Spanish, the infinitive verb is ayudar. Or if it's, necesitar, that would be an infinitive verb. And then we just conjugate it. So we just say, I need to help. And that's really all you need to know. You can apply this concept to anything in Spanish, just like you can apply this concept to anything in English. So you can say, I want to help. I don't want to help. I forget to bring my clothes with me. It's the same concept, and you're going to see it everywhere. Now, let's apply this to something else, right? Let's say, for example, tú, right? The conjugation for tú is a little bit different. You'll notice instead of an O, we add an AS, right? So we would say, tú necesitas. Same thing with help. Tú ayudas. Tú necesitas, tú ayudas. Tú necesitas, tú ayudas. Okay? That's really all there is to it. Now, you can combine this concept as well. So you could say, tú necesitas ayudar. Tú necesitas ayudar. Right? You need to help. And then you could apply this to anything. If you know how to say to study, you could say you need to study, and so on and so forth, right? So we're just adding on. Remember, take your time with this. Yo is for O, and then AS is for tú. So you would say, yo necesito, tú necesitas. Yo ayudo, tú ayudas. And that is all there is to it. With these concepts in mind, you should actually be able to say quite a bit. You understand the concept of an AR verb, you understand what an infinitive verb is, and most importantly, you know how to conjugate those verbs and use a conjugated verb with an infinitive verb. So now, I'm giving you a list of new words right here. Estudiar, right here, get my pointer, make it look fancy. Estudiar, which means to study. Cambiar, which means to change. And olvidar, which means to forget. Now, I will say one thing about the pronunciation before I tell you what I want you to do. If you remember the word adios, right? Adios had an I and an O, and so we pronounced it almost like adios, Dios. It's the same exact concept with estudiar and cambiar. When you pronounce these words, remember that it's not estudiar. It's going to be estudiar, diar. This D-I-A-R is almost like one sound. And same thing right here, cambiar. It's not going to be cambiar. It's going to be cambiar. And that is pretty much it for pronunciation here. Now, what I want you to say is very simple. I want you to say, I study, you study, I need to study, you need to study. And then, after that, you can say, I forget to study, you forget to help. I'm not asking you to say you forgot to help or I forgot to study. Obviously, those would be more natural and more common phrases, but these are technically correct sentences, and they do illustrate the concept very nicely of how you're going to be combining different verbs, right? You need to help, you need to study, and so on and so forth. So go ahead and pause the video right now, look at these phrases, and then try to say each one of them in Spanish. I'm going to give you a second to pause the video. Perfect. Hopefully you got it. Now that you've done that, what I want you to do is go down below and leave me a comment. Tell me, were you successful? Were you not successful? Did you have any trouble? If you had trouble and difficulties, what did you have trouble with? please feel free to leave a comment down below, because chances are you weren't the only one that had problems. The chances that everyone did this 100% correctly the first time is very rare. So go ahead and share what mistakes you made with the class, and I bet you'll be surprised to find that a lot of people had very similar problems, right? So that's pretty much it. I hope you found this to be useful. Now that we have this, we're going to start talking about some other kind of game-changing or fundamental concepts for you. If you know how to say something positively, make a statement, it also makes sense to know how to make a negation, right? And this is so simple that I've honestly only dedicated one slide to it, because it's not that bad. In English, it's a little more complicated, to be honest with you, to make a negative sentence, right? If you want to say, for example, I'm not sad, you would have to say not, but then you would say I don't help. So you have the word not, and then you have do not, and you kind of combine them too. So you'd say I don't help, I don't need to help, I'm not sad, right? So it really depends on the kind of word that you're using. I can't, right? You're using a different word, so you use a different contraction. Pretty complicated, right? In Spanish, you just need to know one word, and that word is no. No in Spanish is no. So the word is pronounced no, okay? You'll notice it's a little shorter than in English, a little shorter, a little rounder. So you would say no. In English, we say no. And you can almost hear my lips moving to distort the sound. Not the case in Spanish. It's a very short, very almost monotone, I would say, sound. It's just a single sound. No. No. Right? And all you do is add the word no before the verb. And now it's negative. For example, yo no necesito estudiar. I don't need to study. I don't need to study. So now you can pretend to be a real smart guy in another language. Just say that. I don't need to study. Tú no necesitas ayudar. Tú no olvidas estudiar. Tú no olvidas estudiar. I'm not even going to tell you the translation for the last two because you already know what they mean. So that is pretty much it. I hope you found that to be useful. It's almost amazing, right? Now you can more or less talk about the present in a relatively basic way. And so now we're going to start looking at different things we can add on to our sentences so we can kind of elaborate in the present. Whenever we're speaking a foreign language, obviously we're going to be using a lot of words, but we're not just going to be using verbs or subject pronouns or other fancy words. We also like to use nouns, and this is probably one of the only things I remember from learning grammar in school, which is like what a noun is, right? It's a person, a place, a thing, an idea, a concept. So a car is a noun. A boat is a noun, coffee is a noun, a curtain is a noun, everything's a noun, right? So, in order to really be able to use nouns correctly, and later on adjectives, you need to understand a concept in Spanish, and that is the concept of masculinity and femininity, which we're going to get into here shortly, and also the idea of an article. So, there are two main types of articles in Spanish, the definite article and the indefinite article. What is a definite article? Well, in English, it's just the word the. That's all you really need to know. It's the word the, all right? And the difference here is that in Spanish, they have 4 different words for the. Sounds crazy, but I promise it's not that bad. Like I said, we use the word in English a lot, and in Spanish, we use the word a lot, so it's going to be easy to remember. We have el, and then we have la. El, la, right? The and the, right? So the question presents itself, when do we use el, and when do we use la? And that is where masculinity and femininity comes in. Basically, nouns can be divided into 2 different categories. The noun is either masculine or it is feminine. And in terms of deciding whether a noun is masculine or feminine, honestly, you can just look at the ending most of the time. There are other things that you can look at, but for the most part, you can just look at the ending of the word. For example, the word noche is going to be feminine in Spanish, but the word dia is going to be masculine. There's no real rhyme or reason as to why this is. It just is. And sorry. But the good news is that most of the time, you can just look at the ending of the word, and this ending will tell you if the word is masculine or feminine. So most words that end in an O are going to be masculine, and most words that end in an A are going to be feminine. So you can see we have a word here for book, ends in an O, it's masculine. We have a word for novel right here, ends in an A, and so it's feminine. It's just that easy. Now, we use the word el with masculine words, and we use the word la with feminine words. So if I want to say the book in Spanish, the word book is masculine, and so I have to use el. And so I would say el libro, el libro. Remember, the I here is pronounced like an E sound, so you would say el libro. Same thing with the pen, right? Ends in an O, so I would use el bolígrafo, el bolígrafo. Lastly, we have la. We use this with words that are feminine. A lot of feminine words end in A, and so we would use la. So we say la novela, la novela. Same thing with the pen here, la pluma, la pluma. Now, you'll notice we have two different words for pen right here, and you may be wondering which one to use. Honestly, you're going to hear both of them. I would say this one, bolígrafo, is more common in Spain and Mexico, and pluma is common in a lot of Latin American countries. The funny part about pluma is like this actually refers to a kind of older style of pen. You know, when people used to write with feathers or quills, this is actually what this refers to, but most Latin Americans don't know that, and so they just use this word when really they're talking about like a physical plastic pen typically. But either way, that is the concept of grammatical gender: el libro, la novela, el bolígrafo, la pluma. Not only do we have definite articles, but we also have indefinite articles. And once again, we're dealing with a lot of fancy terms for simple concepts here. An indefinite article is just the word a or an in English. So for example, an apple or a hero, and a car, an ultimatum or an ultimatum, right? So in Spanish, we have two different words for this. We have un and we have una. And as you can imagine, they are both used depending on whether it's a masculine noun or a feminine noun. And it's the same exact concept. We use un for masculine, una for feminine. And the good news is that the feminine words, una and la, both end in a, so it's easy to remember that they're associated with the feminine. Just like most feminine nouns end in a, most masculine nouns end in o. Now, we have some words here. So we have un título. Right, so título ends in an O, and so I would say un título, right, because it's masculine. Un capítulo, a chapter, right, ends in an O, it's masculine. Lastly, we have the feminine words, una página, so a page, una tapa, a cover. Now, a couple of things to be said here about the accents, because I know that we're seeing a lot of them. First of all, the accent just tells you where the stress is, okay, in the sentence. You'll notice I'm not saying título, right? I say título. I never say título. And I always say capítulo. I never say capítulo. It's always capítulo. So the accent above the letter just tells you where to put your stress. Just like we always say manager and we never say manager. We always say pencil, we never say pencil, right? So we always put the stress in different places in English. In Spanish, the good news is that most of the time the stress is going to be on the second to last syllable or the penultimate syllable. For example, tapa. You'll notice the second to last syllable is ta. And so that's where the stress is. I never say tapa. I always say tapa. Same thing if we go back here to the novel right here. The second to last syllable is the VE. And so I would say novela. I would never say novela. I always say novela. Same thing here. Pluma. Libro. But whenever the stress is not on the second to last syllable, we typically add an accent. So it's bolígrafo. Same thing right here, título, capítulo, página. And this is just to tell you that the stress is not on the second to last syllable. And that's really the basic concept and all you really need to remember to pronounce the stress correctly or to put the stress in the right place. But that is not the key takeaway here. The key takeaway, my dear friend, is masculine and feminine. El or la, un or una. And as a side note, tapa isn't just the cover of a book. It can also be used to mean like the lid on a container, just so you can have another word to use in your tool belt. Welcome to part 2. Honestly, you've learned quite a bit, and I'm sure your head's hurting, so I hope you took a break, kind of reviewed everything that you learned. Remember, the intention here isn't to just swallow everything as quickly as you can. I mean, of course, you do want to do this efficiently and try to go at a pretty good pace, but at the end of the day, I would rather you learn 5 things and remember 5 things than learn 10 things and remember 2. So remember to make sure that you've assimilated the concepts, you're able to actually use them and say the words, okay? That's another key thing, is to actually say the words and actually speak the words, because you're using a different part of your brain when you speak than when you listen. So with that being said, we're going to dive into the second part and kind of explore some new concepts. That way you can say even more cool stuff. Now, first we'll start off with some more phrases. In this case, we're going to be talking about felicidades, which is congratulations, and verificación, or confirmation or verification. Now, for felicidades, you have a number of different things that you could say. You could say enhorabuena, which means congratulations. So then you have felicidades, which is congratulations again. And then we have que bien, which means that's great or that's good. So if someone says, I just got a promotion, you could say, oh, que bien, that's great. Or felicidades, congratulations. And then for verification, you could also say en serio, which means seriously or really. And then another way to say that is de verdad. De verdad. Now, an interesting thing to note about de verdad is that the emphasis is going to be on the dad, right here, the dad, right here. And that's because it ends in AD. I know I told you that if the word is going to be a normal Spanish word without an accent on it, the stress is on the penultimate syllable. So in this case, it would be enhorabuena, right? But if it ends in a DAD, then the stress is on this last syllable right here. So that's a small thing. Now, in terms of the differences between enhorabuena and felicidades, there's really not that much of a difference. You can pretty much use these interchangeably. So if someone said, I just bought a new car, you could say felicidades. And if someone just had a new kid, you could say enhorabuena. But honestly, most of the time I hear felicidades. That's probably the more common one that I hear. And then, of course, que bien, which is a very common one as well. En serio and de verdad are very interchangeable, but out of the two, I hear en serio a lot more often, okay? Now, we will talk about how to pronounce these words and a couple of new concepts that you may have already picked up on. I know I kind of went off on pronunciation in the previous section, but I feel it is worth repeating. So, we'll talk briefly about pronunciation, specifically stress in Spanish, and one other key thing. Now, remember what I said before. Whenever you have syllables, right? A syllable, if you don't remember from school, is just a collection of letters, essentially. And the way that I learned to count syllables in school was simply to clap. So if you had a word like manager, you would say manager, like that. And you can hear that there's 3 different syllables in that word. So whenever I say the second to last syllable or the penultimate syllable, what I mean is this one right here, VE. So it's novela. So the be is the second to last syllable, and that is where we typically put the stress in Spanish. So you would say novela, right? Novela. Same thing here. The second to last syllable is ta, and it also is the first. So you would say tapa. Anytime in Spanish that they do not put the stress on the second to last syllable, they will tell you by putting an accent above the word. So anytime that you look up the word in a dictionary, you're going to know if the stress is on the second to last syllable or if they decided to put it somewhere else, as is the case with página and capítulo, right? You can see that they don't put the stress on the second to last syllable, and so they give you a little accent to tell you, hey, this is where the stress is, right here. But with libro, it's just a normal word, and so you would just say libro, just like that. The other thing to point out here is you'll notice that the G is not pronounced like a J. It's not pronounced página, right? Instead, we pronounce it página. Basically, the rule is is that if a G is next to an E or an I, for all intents and purposes, it's pronounced like an English H. So I'd say na, página. In some parts of Spain, for example, you'll hear this pronounced more strongly, like a página. You'll notice it's kind of more like a sound, so it's página. But in most parts of Latin America, and even in Spain, whenever they're speaking more quickly, a lot of times you'll hear it pronounced almost like an English H, just página. Okay, so just another key thing to remember, but those are some basic pronunciation tips. Remember, most of the time, it's the penultimate syllable. So for pronouncing these new words right here, we can kind of use it as an opportunity to go over some new concepts as well as a couple of things that may seem weird to you. So first of all, the UE in this case, right? So enhorabuena. You may have noticed that I didn't say like enhorabuena or something like that, but the U and the E, whenever they're together, they're basically pronounced as a we, like almost like a W, like where are they or when did they go? So it's buena. Similar to what we learned before with hasta luego, right? It's luego, hasta luego. And then the other interesting part right here is the que, right here, the que. So whenever you say UE with a Q right here, so QUE, it's just pronounced as que. So que bien, right? Que bien. And lastly, for the pronunciation here, we have another yes sound right here. So we have the I and the E right here. And so whenever the I is next to another vowel, it makes like a Y sound, essentially. So you would say que, bien, bien, bien. Similar to what we learned with en serio, right? En serio. So it's just this Y sound right here because it's next to a vowel. Just like when we learned estudiar, cambiar, all of those different words right there. Whenever we use those words, right, we have an I and an A, estudiar, and so we pronounce the I as if it were a Y, okay? So feel free to practice these, take your time, and once you kind of internalize them, I'm sure you're going to hear them all the time. In the last part, we actually talked about how essentially we have different categories of infinitive verbs, and we saw the AR verb, that is a verb that ends in AR, and now we'll talk about the second of the three categories, the ER verbs, and as you could probably imagine, ER verbs are just verbs that end in ER. That's really all there is to it. So an infinitive verb with no subject, we have aprender, which means to learn, aprender, right there. And then we have leer, which means to read. The only difference here is that they end in AR. Another important thing to note is that you'll notice that we have two E's right here, but these E's are each a part of a separate syllable. So you would say leer, so leer, aprender, leer, aprender, just like that. So you can just put a little pause there, leer, and that means to read. Now, the way that we conjugate them is actually very similar to the way that we conjugate AR verbs. So, for example, if we have our subject pronouns, right, yo, I, and tú, you, then we can say yo aprendo and yo leo, right? And that just means I learn, I read, okay? So then we have this little change like we had with AR verbs. So it's aprender, and then we just take off the ER and add an O. Aprendo. Leer, leo. Just like that. Similar to hablar is to speak, yo hablo. And then, for example, cambiar is to change, yo cambio. I change. Just like that. So now I want you to actually try this out with a couple of new words. Not to worry, these words are not that hard to remember. It's just the names of different languages. So we have francés, inglés, japonés, portugués, español. Okay? So that's French, English, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish. Francés, inglés, japonés, portugués, español. That's all there is. Now, I just want you to use these different words in different sentences that you technically know how to say. So I study Japanese, you learn Portuguese, you speak Spanish, I don't speak French, you don't need to learn English, I don't read, That's not a typo. I just meant to say I don't read. That's it. I read a book. You don't read the chapter. I forget to read the title. Now, a little hint here for these negative sentences, I don't, you don't. Just remember we put the word no before the verb. That's all you need to know. So if I wanted to say I don't forget, I would say no olvido. That's all I would do. No olvido. Yo no olvido. Right? So go ahead and pause the video right now. Try this out. And then once you finish, go ahead and unpause the video and I'll tell you how to say them. Okay, hopefully you got that. So I will kind of walk you through them right now. Yo estudio japonés. Yo estudio japonés. Because estudiar is to study. So yo estudio is I study. Yo estudio japonés. Tú aprendes portugués. Tú aprendes portugués. So I didn't actually teach you how to conjugate ER verbs into you, right? I didn't really show you how to do that. And it's actually quite simple. You remember how we would say hablar, and then we would say tú hablas? So we just add the S. It's the same exact concept with ER verbs. So I would say tú aprendes. Tú lees. So we just add the S. And I didn't include that so that way you could try to kind of guess, and sometimes I'm gonna just let you guess what it is. Now back to the subject here. You speak Spanish. Tú hablas español. I don't speak French. No, yo no hablo francés. You don't need to learn English. Tú no necesitas aprender inglés. You'll notice we're using the infinitive aprender to learn, right? Yo no leo. I don't read. Yo leo un libro. I read a book. Tú no lees el capítulo. You don't read the chapter. Yo olvido leer el título. I forget to read the title. And that is really all there is to it. So make sure to go over this. Try to experiment with some of the other words you know, like tapa, for example, or página, or pluma, or bolígrafo, and all of those different words. And then you can move on to the next video. This one's going to be a short one for sure, but definitely one that I feel is worth mentioning. In the previous video, we learned a couple of new words, actually, different languages, right? Francés, Inglés, Japonés, Portugués, Español. And so those different words are technically nouns, right? They are nouns. So you could say French is an interesting language, and that would be a noun in that case. And I just taught you that for nouns, if it ends in an O, it's masculine, and if it ends in an A, it's feminine. But as you can see, not a single one of these nouns actually end in an O or an A. So what does this mean? Well, it means that, first of all, not every word in the Spanish language ends in an O and an A. Some of them end in a D or an S or an L. You know, it depends. So what does this mean for us? How do we know if it's masculine or feminine? Well, in this case, it's rather simple. Languages are masculine. That's all you really need to know. So if you want to say, for example, Korean, Korean is masculine. Or if you want to say, what's another language? I'm at Tagalog, for example. That would be masculine. So languages as nouns in the Spanish language are actually masculine. We'll continue on and expand on what we've already learned about subject pronouns. Now, before we learn how to say I, which is yo, I was hoping you would say it, and then you, which is tú. That's exactly right. Now we'll look at he and she, which is él and then ella, right? Él is for he, ella is for she. And then it, you may be wondering how to say it. Well, the interesting thing is we actually don't translate that in Spanish, and I'm going to expand on that in more detail later. There are some situations where you could translate it. We'll talk about those. But as a subject, we don't really translate the word it. So we would never say, for example, it is very interesting. It doesn't really happen a lot in Spanish. But él is for he, ella is for she. That is the main concept. Now, how do we use this with verbs? How do we conjugate verbs with he and she? And it's actually quite straightforward. This is how we do it. So we have yo aprendo, as I learn. Tú aprendes, which is you learn. And now he and she. Él aprende, ella aprende. So it's he learns and she learns. So very similar conjugations here. We have O, then we have ES, and then we just have E right here. And that is because it is an ER verb. If this were an AR verb, it would be a little different, right? So in this case, you can see I have hablar, which means to speak. So we have yo hablo, tú hablas, él habla, ella habla. So it's the same pattern, but it has a different ending, right? AR verb, ER verb. But that is the basic concept. We have yo aprendo, tú aprendes, él aprende, ella aprende. Yo hablo, tú hablas, él habla, ella habla. And that is it right there. That is all there is to it. So you can experiment with this if you'd like to. Try out some different verb conjugations. Try using he and she instead of you and I, and see how that goes for you. But everything that we've learned about combining them with infinitives and things like that, all of those things still apply. Now I would like to expand your vocabulary ever so slightly and introduce you to the concept of guessing. I mean, it's not a new concept, obviously, but it is a good one to know for sure when you're speaking a language that has some similarities with Spanish, thanks to the Romance language's influence on the English language. So, with that being said, we're going to talk about how we can say different subjects in English or Spanish, or both, if you want. Now, the first, you can see here, we have 4 different words, and I did not put a translation here because honestly, you don't need it. Just because they're so similar, you can kind of guess what they mean, right? So the first one here is la química, la química. And that means chemistry, and that's probably the hardest one to guess. But this one right here is a little more obvious, la física, right? La física. And it means physics. And then lastly, we have la psicología, la psicología, and la biología, la biología. And those are the different subjects: psychology, biology, physics, and chemistry. Probably the most beautiful part about this is that it makes it very easy to guess what something is going to be. As long as it ends in something like this, like anatomy, anthropology, physiology, you can kind of guess what it means, and that's exactly what I want you to do right now. Go ahead and pause the video and just guess what these words are in Spanish. Go ahead and pause. I'll wait a second. All right, so hopefully you got it, and I bet you were spot on. We have anatomía, antropología, and then physiología, excuse me. So anatomy, anthropology, and physiology right there. So it's pretty easy to guess what a subject is going to be in Spanish, even if you're not really sure what it is because you've never looked it up in the dictionary. But for example, linguistics is going to be lingüística, right? But there are others that are a little less predictable, like botany is botánica, which botanical gardens, kind of easy to remember, but not that easy to guess. So for the most part, if you're not sure what a word like this is going to be, for example, about a subject, then you can definitely take a swing at it. Obviously, if you get it wrong, make sure to consult your dictionary afterwards and make sure to know the exact right word. But for now, this is definitely a quick way to expand your vocabulary. And once again, all of these words are indeed feminine. Now, what I want you to do is try out all of these different words with some of the new things that you know how to say. So for example, I study chemistry, he doesn't learn psychology, you do not speak Portuguese, she learns physics, I understand anatomy. Now, there's one word in here that you obviously don't know, which is understand, but it's actually comprender. That is one word for understand. Now you'll notice it's an ER verb, so all you need to know is the verb in the infinitive form, and then you can conjugate it rather easily. So go ahead and try this out. Once you have tried this out, please do leave me a comment if you have any questions about what you did here, and make sure to share your results with everybody. Tell them what you had trouble with and what you didn't have trouble with, and I'm sure they will be willing to help you out. So far, I've seen a lot of really cool communities with cool people, and so people are very willing to help you out if you have any questions or if you make any mistakes. And I'm sure someone else made a similar mistake. So that is pretty much it. I hope you found this to be useful.